The recent decision by U.S. President Donald Trump to cut funding to South Africa and launch an investigation into its land reform policies has ignited a diplomatic firestorm. Trump's assertion that the new Expropriation Act constitutes a massive human rights violation against white landowners has drawn sharp criticism from the South African government, which argues that the law is a constitutional mechanism designed to redress historical injustices. At the heart of this controversy is a long-standing issue in South Africa, the redistribution of land to address racial disparities entrenched by apartheid-era policies. While proponents of the law see it as a necessary step toward economic justice, opponents, including some South African opposition parties, warn that it could undermine property rights and deter foreign investment. Is this true or not? Professor Roux, economist at Stellenbosch Business School in South Africa, joins me for more on this. Good morning, Professor, and thank you for joining me today.
Good morning, and welcome to all your viewers.
Absolutely. Now, South Africa's land expropriation law is currently under scrutiny. But before we get to that, I'd like you to tell us what necessitated the law and what it is about.
Yes, well, let me first of all point out that I'm an economist and not a constitutional expert. But obviously, South Africa's history means that for various reasons, historical reasons, a large portion of land, now the whole definition of land becomes an interesting one, but let's say farmland, has ended up in the possession of predominantly white farmers. And therefore, in the process, it is argued many previous owners from other population groups were their land was disowned, was taken away from them, and now it's only deserving they should get some of that back. Now, initially, the idea was based on what they call a willing buyer, willing seller principle. In other words, it would be a normal commercial transaction, and the government would probably buy back some of the farmlands and then present it to the previous owners who had a claim going back many, many decades. But over the last 30 years, not much progress has been made there for various reasons. My understanding of the new clause, if you like, in the bill is not that we are abandoning the idea of willing buyer, willing seller. It's more about repossessing land at a low value, as they say, as a very last resort. And it doesn't imply that farms are going to be repossessed. It could be public land that's not being used, or it could be private land not being used, maybe to build roads. So I think in many ways there's been an overhype of what this is telling us. I think we also need to see this as part of a bigger picture when we think about Donald Trump and South Africa and indeed Africa. And we also saw earlier this week that he shut down U.S. aid, calling it evil, amongst other things. And Elon Musk saying it needs to be killed. So it's not just about, let's say, sanctioning South Africa for our laws, but just a more generalized kind of concerted effort, so it seems, to dry up aid and other forms of involvement in Africa and indeed South Africa. So if U.S. aid shuts down, already we note throughout the continent consternation, concern, fear, worry about the shutting down of, for instance, close to $20 billion worth of aid aimed only at assisting those who need antiretroviral therapy. It means that a number of health research institutes throughout the continent might see their much-needed funding cut off. We add to that, of course, the whole question of tariffs, which so far this week has focused on Canada, Mexico, and China, but there is that sort of sword hanging over everybody in the world, suggesting that they might introduce tariffs on any goods imported by America from anywhere in the world. So it's kind of a triple, if not a quadruple whammy that we're looking at, as I say, not just regarding South Africa, but the whole of the continent ought to be concerned. Just to give you one or two interesting figures, thus far, the biggest aid source in Africa is still the USA. Obviously, China's catching up very quickly, but the USA is extremely important. When we look at the beneficiaries of US aid, it's interesting that Africa's not at the top of the list. Countries like Ukraine, Israel, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Egypt makes the list, Ethiopia makes the list of the top 10. Nigeria is roughly number 9th on the list of recipients. These are substantial amounts. And as I say, the other concern is that this kind of boycott might kind of filter through to investment decisions. As it is for the last roughly 12, 13 years, China's overtaken America as the biggest investor, fixed investor in Africa, but America remains extremely big and important.
All right. Thank you, Professor.
If I may just add one more thing, trade. Trade is also being pressured. Trade might also come under pressure. Again, America being Africa's second biggest trade partner after third biggest after the European Union and China.
All right, Professor, we'll come to the quadruple whammy. Yes, we'll come to the quadruple whammy. But before we get to the quadruple whammy or the triple whammy or the trilemma, as some have described this whole situation, I want us to get back to this particular act. And that's because I've also seen that many South Africans are also against it. Some politicians, some political parties like DA, they're also against it. So I want us to sort of speak from South African perspective first before we then go out into global events, global trade and geopolitics. So talk to us, still coming back to this particular act. Do you share the concerns of many who have said the process of passing this law was flawed, and some have even gone as far as saying it's unconstitutional? We know that the government, through the ANC Secretary General, had said, no, it's not unconstitutional because we went through a 5-year process before we came up with this particular law. Now, looking at this and what some other persons are saying, what do you think? Do you also have fears or concerns, or what do you have to say about their concerns?
Yes, well, again, I must point out I'm an economist, not a constitutional expert at all, or a legal expert, but my understanding is that it did go through the right procedures. One can understand why there is concern and resistance in certain circles. It might be perceived as a kind of a land grab, and people in South Africa can't help reminding themselves of what happened recently in Zimbabwe, where we saw a few years ago Mr. then President Mugabe literally taking land away from farmers. Not only was that conceived to be unfair, but also the effects were negative on the whole economy. Food production plummeted in Zimbabwe because the new owners weren't all that well equipped to engage in commercial farming. So the concerns are understandable. I really do think it is a storm in a teacup. I don't think we're going to see mass or even minor land grabs, as it were, agricultural land grabs taking place. So that would be my opinion. But obviously, politics is another game. Opposition parties have to, I presume, express their dislike or dismay of certain decisions. But also bear in mind, as you know, we now have a government of national unity. So what's going to be very important, in fact, tomorrow we have our State of the Nation address. One hopes that this kind of decision, and there's been a few others over the last few weeks, one pertaining to education, where again the opposition parties are very concerned. One pertaining, it's been ongoing for a while, the National Health Insurance Act. And one hopes that these glitches, that these differences of opinion won't derail the government of national unity, because the market perception of the GNU is a favorable one. We don't want to see that benefit disappearing if for some reason the coalition or the alliance were to decide to part ways. I mean, that should be part of the bigger concern, the coherence, the strength, the robustness of the government of national unity.
Right, I like that you have mentioned that, because I was coming to that. So away from that and away from whether or not it went through the right process, some South Africans have also said one of its limitations is that it does not intend to address land reform. Rather, it is intended to empower the state to acquire land on a generic sense for its own usage. Do you think that is what it is? I just want us to sort of address the concerns South Africans have raised before we then move on to the bigger stage.
Yeah. Again, I need to stress I'm not a constitutional expert, and I was invited to this talk to talk about the question of how South Africa might suffer from Trump's policies. But again, I would say I don't think the government intends grabbing land for its own purposes. I do think their intentions are honorable, in as much as they would like to bring about some land reform, land redistribution, addressing the so-called legacies of the past. But they're not going to embark upon the large-scale, rash, reckless land grabs we saw a few years ago in Zimbabwe. I don't see that happening at all. I think there are enough checks and balances within this government of national unity. By the way, the Minister of Agriculture in the new government is actually the leader of the Democratic Alliance. So I'm sure he's got some clout in the way these things go forward. As is often the case, the devil's in the detail, how they're going to implement these policies and these constitutional clauses. But really, and maybe I'm naive, but I don't see this as being a major concern. I don't think it's a big surprise either, to be perfectly frank.
All right, so should the U.S. government proceed with sanctions against South Africa, what will be the impact?
Well, certainly not positive. And I think the big question then, one of the big questions then would be, to what extent will China step into the breach? And again, I'm not just talking about South Africa, I'm talking about the whole continent. I think the whole continent should be concerned about things such as AGOA, things such as the reduction of aid throughout the continent, things such as trade relations. So I think it cannot be positive. The question is, would China step into the breach? Will the BRICS grouping step into the breach? Will they put their money where their mouths are? That'll be interesting. You're showing a chart right now confirming the fact the US is the largest single donor of aid globally. And that is across the world, but as you're pointing out there, quite a lot of that goes towards Eurasia or parts of Europe. Israel's a big beneficiary. Nigeria, I think, makes the list somewhere there. These are important amounts. And it's not just about aid. You know, just as this kind of a sub-narrative, for many years, there's always been this question as to whether aid is a good thing. One would argue that the problem with aid is it makes the recipients, they kind of become addicted to aid, and they don't really become self-sufficient. But leaving that aside, it is what it is, and millions of Africans rely heavily, in some cases for their survival, on aid from the USA. So that alone would be a blow, socioeconomically. If at the same time, our trade with America is derailed or disrupted through tariffs and or being removed from AGOA, naturally that would be a big blow to any economy. And then if America investors should decide that they would prefer not to invest too much here, again, a big blow, unless China takes up the slack. But certainly in the short term, this cannot be extremely good or positive news.
All right. So on the one hand, I would like you to talk about, what BRICS should do, how BRICS should sort of, address this on the one hand. And on the other hand, I remember speaking to someone, and that person was talking about how that multilateralism is probably fading away, and we need to pay attention to bilateralism. Talk to us. What do you even make of that?
Yeah, well, as I say, that's going to be the very big challenge and question regarding BRICS. We do know that BRICS, or BRICS Plus, if you like, has all kinds of ambitions, including, some would argue, trying to de-dollarize global markets. And that's probably also one of the reasons why Donald Trump is acting so almost proactively. He doesn't want to see that happening. Donald Trump wants the world to recognize the fact, in his view, that America is the biggest and the bestest, as it were. He feels that for many years, America has not received that recognition. Now, that's an ego thing. He would certainly go out of his way to prevent the de-dollarization of global trade and global reserves. As it is, by the way, if you have a look at the world's total foreign exchange reserves, 60% still denominated in dollars. So a long way to go before any other currency makes meaningful inroads into that. So what could BRICS do? Well, probably not all that much. As a grouping, we have the so-called BRICS Bank. They could provide a bit of aid, a bit of assistance, but it wouldn't be monumental. The big leader, of course, is China. China alone is 60% in terms of the economy of the entire BRICS grouping. So we'd have to take a cue from them. But then again, we'd have to think about Donald Trump, unfortunately, and Team Trump, because in his view, any friend of an enemy of America as an enemy of America. So they regard South Africa, for instance, and other countries as being very friendly and supportive of the likes of China and Russia, and they are anti-Israel. He would want them to change their opinion. They're not going to do so easily, which I think does mean that quiet politics, quiet diplomacy behind the scenes has to become the name of the game. I think making statements in public, criticizing each other in public doesn't really help the cause. I think politicians, presidents, finance ministers, international affairs ministers need to really have good talks, meaningful talks behind the scenes with diplomats and the like from the USA. Ultimately, I think the benefit of all of this is that unlike in days gone past, where very often Africa's trade has relied very heavily on one or two trade partners, we might see that diversification of trade partners could indeed be beneficial. You don't want to be over-dependent on just one or two big trade partners. But we're talking long-term here. In the short term, these things could be damaging.
Thank you so much, Professor Andre Roux, economist at Stellenbosch Business School in South Africa. I mean, it's been a wonderful conversation with you. I look forward to having some more on this topic. Thank you so much.